The town of Ashwood was peaceful. It was tucked away in the countryside, far from the noise of the city. Everyone knew each other, their names, their pasts, even their secrets. Life moved slower here, following the rhythm of nature. Julia found peace in this quiet place. She had always felt out of place in the city, lost among all the strangers. She had inherited her grandmother's farmhouse just outside of Ashwood. It stood alone, surrounded by fields that seemed to go on forever. It was an old, sprawling house with creaky floors and dusty windows, but it felt like home. Julia spent her days taking care of the garden, reading by the warm fireplace, and exploring the nearby countryside. The silence was her friend, a welcome change from the constant noise of her old life. But the nights were different. As the sun went down, a coldness settled over the house. Shadows grew longer, twisting familiar shapes into scary figures. Julia would lie awake in her grandmother's old bed, listening to the wind howl down the chimney. Sometimes she would hear other noises too, soft whispers, barely audible. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, faint murmurs that sent shivers down her spine. At first, Julia brushed them off as just the wind or her imagination playing tricks in the dark. But the whispers continued, getting louder each night. They seemed to be calling her name, pulling her towards something unknown. Fear began to creep into Julia's peaceful world. She realized that the isolation she had wanted wasn't the comforting hug she had imagined. It was a cage, and she was trapped inside. One night, the whispers became clear. They changed from faint murmurs into distinct words, hissing her name with an urgency that sent a jolt of terror through Julia's heart. She lay frozen in bed, unable to breathe as the voice seemed to slide around the room, bouncing off the walls. It was a cold, ghostly voice, empty of any warmth or kindness. It spoke of secrets buried deep, of a darkness that had seeped into the very foundation of the house. Julia couldn't ignore it anymore. Pulling the blankets tightly around her, she forced herself out of bed and crept towards the source of the whispers. The voice seemed to be strongest near the old grandfather clock that stood guard in the hallway. Its pendulum swung back and forth like a hypnotic eye, ticking away the seconds like a countdown to some unknown horror. As Julia got closer to the clock, the voice grew louder, more insistent. It urged her to listen, to uncover the truth hidden within the house. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, Julia began to search. She ran her fingers over the cold, smooth wood of the clock, looking for any sign of a hidden button or a secret compartment. The whispers seemed to urge her on, guiding her towards her goal. Finally, her fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible latch hidden beneath the clock face. With a click, a hidden panel swung open, revealing a small, dusty keyhole. Julia's heart pounded in her chest. She knew instinctively that this was the key to the secrets that haunted the house. But where could she find the key? The whispers offered no more clues, only a constant, chilling repetition of her name, a reminder that she was now bound to the darkness that had taken root in her grandmother's house. The whispers didn't return that night. Julia lay awake, listening for any sound, but the house was eerily quiet. The silence was more unsettling than the whispers. It felt heavy, oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the next move. She knew she couldn't ignore what she had found. The keyhole behind the clock face taunted her, a constant reminder of the mystery that lay at the heart of the house. She had to find the key. The next morning, Julia began her search. She examined every corner of the house, her fingers tracing the outlines of her grandmother's belongings, searching for any sign of the key. She went through old boxes in the attic, filled with faded photographs and yellowed letters. She searched through drawers in the old writing desk, finding nothing but scraps of paper and dried-out inkwells. The house offered no further clues. Just when Julia was about to give up hope, she stumbled upon a loose floorboard in the pantry. It creaked ominously under her weight. Prying it open, she discovered a small tarnished key lying in the darkness beneath. It was cold to the touch, as if it had been buried there for centuries. Julia knew instantly that this was the key she had been searching for, the key to the hidden heart of the house. With the key in hand, Julia made her way down to the cellar. The cellar was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Cobwebs hung from the rafters like ghostly shrouds. Julia's footsteps echoed on the cold stone floor as she approached a heavy wooden door set into the far wall. It was a door that had always been there, but one that she had never dared to open until now. The key turned in the lock with a heavy thud, breaking the silence that had hung in the air for centuries. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow descending staircase that disappeared into darkness. The air that wafted up from the stairwell was stale and cold, carrying with it the faintest hint of damp earth and something else, something unnameable that sent a shiver down Julia's spine. The whispers started again, softer this time, almost like a gentle nudge. Despite her fear, Julia felt a strange pull towards the darkness that lay beyond the door. Armed with nothing but a flickering oil lamp, she took a deep breath and began her descent. The steps were uneven and treacherous, worn smooth by the passage of time and countless unseen feet. The air grew colder and more oppressive with each step, pressing down on Julia like an invisible weight. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning into the bowels of the earth. The walls were damp and slick, the stone cold and unforgiving against her touch. The whispers grew stronger as she descended, swirling around her like phantoms trapped in the darkness. They spoke of pain and suffering, of a hunger that could never be satisfied. Julia's heart pounded in her chest, her every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But she pressed on, driven by a force she couldn't quite comprehend. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened up into a small, square chamber. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something acrid and cloying that made Julia's stomach churn. In the center of the chamber stood a large wooden chest, its surface carved with strange and disturbing symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering lamplight. Julia approached the chest cautiously, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch its surface. The wood was rough beneath her fingertips, as if it were alive and pulsing with some dark energy. The whispers swirled around her, louder now, filled with a desperate urgency. They seemed to emanate from the chest itself, begging to be released from their prison. With a deep breath, Julia lifted the heavy lid of the chest. The hinges groaned in protest, releasing a musty, earthy smell that caused Julia to gag. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a collection of objects that made her blood run cold. There was a lock of hair, as black as night and strangely stiff, as if it had been cut from the head of a corpse. Beside it lay a small bone-handled knife, its blade stained a rusty brown. And finally, there was a leather-bound book, its pages filled with faded ink and strange symbols that seemed to writhe and pulsate under Julia's gaze. As Julia reached out to touch the book, the whispers reached a crescendo, a cacophony of voices that seemed to tear at her mind. She stumbled back, clutching her ears as the voices assaulted her with images of unimaginable horror. She saw glimpses of dark rituals, of sacrifices made under a blood-red moon. She saw her grandmother, her face contorted in a mask of fanaticism, her hands stained crimson. Julia understood then. The whispers were not merely the product of her imagination. They were real. The tormented souls trapped within the walls of the house, imprisoned by her grandmother's dark legacy. And she, Julia, was somehow connected to it all. Driven by a desperate need to understand, Julia sank to the floor and opened the leather-bound book. The pages crackled like dry leaves as she turned them, each one filled with chilling illustrations and cryptic texts written in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. The book described a ritual, a deal made with an ancient and powerful entity in exchange for immortality. But the ritual was incomplete. It required a sacrifice, a final blood offering, to seal the deal. As Julia delved deeper into the text, a horrifying realization dawned on her. The faces of the people in the illustrations, their features twisted in agony and fear, they were familiar. She had seen them before, in the old photographs lining the hallway of the house. They were her ancestors, stretching back generations, each one a victim in this gruesome lineage, each one sacrificed to fuel her grandmother's insatiable thirst for eternal life. The air in the chamber grew heavy with a palpable sense of dread as Julia realized the truth. Her grandmother hadn't simply stumbled upon this ancient power, she had cultivated it, nurtured it, sacrificing her own family to appease its insatiable hunger. And now, Julia, the last remaining descendant, was the final piece of the puzzle. The whispers reached a fever pitch, swirling around Julia as if trying to possess her to force her to complete the ritual. They whispered temptations of power and immortality, of transcending the limitations of mortality and joining them in their eternal existence. But Julia felt only horror and revulsion. She refused to be a part of this legacy of blood and madness. Scrambling back from the chest, Julia stumbled to her feet and ran towards the tunnel entrance, desperate to escape the suffocating confines of the chamber. But as she ran, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. Dust rained down from the ceiling as the walls around her groaned and shifted. The house was awakening. Panicked, Julia stumbled and fell the oil lamp, slipping from her grasp and plunging the tunnel into darkness. She lay there for a moment, her heart pounding against her ribs, listening to the sounds of the house groaning and shifting around her. The whispers were all around her now, no longer seductive but filled with a cold, malevolent glee. They had her trapped. Scrambling to her feet, Julia pushed herself up and ran blindly through the darkness, her hands outstretched, feeling for the rough stone walls of the tunnel. The air was thick with dust and the smell of damp earth, making it difficult to breathe. The ground continued to tremble beneath her feet, the tremors growing stronger with each passing moment. Suddenly, the tunnel lurched violently, throwing Julia against the wall with bone-jarring force. She cried out in pain as she hit the ground, her vision swimming with black spots. Struggling to her feet, she realized with growing horror that the tunnel was shrinking, the walls closing in around her like a vice. Panic clawed at her throat, threatening to overwhelm her. She could feel the cold, damp stone pressing in on her from all sides, squeezing the air from her lungs. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of tormented voices reveling in her terror. They had her trapped, and there was no escape. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline, Julia threw herself forward, squeezing through a narrow opening in the collapsing tunnel wall, just as the passage behind her slammed shut with a deafening roar. She lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, her body racked with pain. She had escaped, but the house was alive, its hunger unsated. Julia eventually managed to make her way back to the cellar stairs, her clothes torn, her body bruised and battered. She emerged from the cellar into the cold light of dawn, feeling as if she had stepped through a veil and into a nightmare. The house stood silent and imposing, its windows dark and lifeless. But beneath the surface, Julia could sense a malevolent presence lurking, waiting for its next victim. She knew then that she could never truly leave this place. The house had chosen her, just as it had chosen countless others before her. She was bound to it now, tethered to its dark legacy. And as the whispers began to stir once more, their voices echoing through the empty rooms, Julia knew that the cycle was far from over. The house was waiting, and it would not be denied its due. It was only a matter of time before the whispers found a new voice to lure, a new soul to claim. The whispers in the walls were eternal, a testament to the darkness that lay at the heart of Ashwood.